Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. This is episode 341, and today's guest is Somak Chattopadhyay, managing partner at Armory Square Ventures. Yes, markets like the Bay Area, New York City, and Boston get a lot of attention when it comes to building startups and having the ability to raise capital, but there are lots of other places to build a successful company. This has always been the case, but the pandemic definitely pushed this reality further. This is why a firm like Armory Square Ventures exists. There are lots of secondary markets where entrepreneurs need access to capital, and it is also a very important matter for the local economy for these companies to grow and create jobs versus relocating. Somak shares the details of what led him down the path to start Armory Square Ventures, a seed and early stage venture fund, and why their approach of investing in secondary markets has not only been a differentiator for the firm, but what they also consider as an optimism engine and a community catalyst for regions outside of Silicon Valley. In this episode of our podcast, we cover lots of great topics, like advice on how founders can push back on advice from investors, Somak's background story and his early career in startups, how he landed in venture capital at Edison Ventures and Tribeca Venture Partners, the details on what they are targeting for investments and portfolio company examples like Machinery Partner and ACV Auctions, a Buffalo company that went public, Somak's anti-portfolio, which are companies that he reviewed, but an investment didn't quite work out and went on to be a successful company, advice on building a marketplace, and so much more. Okay, quick side note. This week's episode is sponsored by MarketMuse, a content intelligence platform that sets the standard for content quality. Their AI-powered software enables companies to create predictably better content at scale that increases traffic and engagement, improves productivity, and drives revenue. Get more out of your content with packages starting at $0 a month. That is free. Plus, you can get 20% off the MarketMuse standard plan by using our code FIZZ20, that's FIZZ20, at checkout. Go to marketmuse.com to get started. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Somak. Somak, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Keith. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Likewise, I'm excited to talk to you because we're going to talk about obviously you as an investor and all the great work you're doing, not just in major metropolitans, but you're also a fund that's focused on outer reaching areas outside of the core cities that a lot of people think of when venture capitalists are making investments, which is awesome. But to kick things off, so you always hear about founders, looking for smart capital. When they raise capital from their investors, they're hoping to hopefully get some advice to grow their business and to help them along the way of their journey with different things, maybe hiring or other go-to-market strategy and a whole slew of things that investors typically have a point of view. But I thought it'd be interesting to kind of take a different angle. Like, when should founders kind of like push back? Sometimes, maybe investors maybe are too opinionated, or maybe they don't agree with their opinion. And it's like, how do you be gentle that you aren't, creating a conflict in the relationship?
Yeah, I think, so it's the answer of actually a bunch of entrepreneurs ask me this question. So I really appreciate you bringing this issue up, is about, what is the right balance between giving advice and guidance and ultimately becoming more dictatorial or micromanaging? Is that what your question is? Keith, right?
Yeah. Like,
Uh,
because you might not
uh,
always agree, but like, well, I don't know if that's right based on our research or data, right? Like, but then they have the pattern. Maybe they've seen it multiple times, right?
Right. So I think, the reality is I think first, I guess to answer the question, I think if I'm advising another entrepreneur, is like, you have to think about, as an entrepreneur, if you look at your own DNA, like, what type of relationship do you want with your investor that you're ultimately partnering with, right? If your idea is that you want to get an investment, you're happy to do some basic reporting, quarterly, but you otherwise want that investor out of your hair and not to really give your opinion. There are pools of capital that, that might allow you to execute that strategy, at least for angel rounds. Once you start raising meaningful rounds, it gets a little bit more difficult to do that, right? But I think that one thing that I think is important is to make sure you set the ground rules about how, with each other, about how you want to work together, right? I mean, from our perspective, the type of entrepreneurs that ASV wants to partner with, we really get excited about riffing on all areas of company building, but especially on the talent and organizational design side. right? So the idea is that we're not going to be opining on your how your if you're how you know your chief of staff or your marketing manager. We're focusing really on the C-suite, the people who are going to be the people who are going to be leading engineering, sales, and marketing, right? And we've seen this movie play out numerous times, and we've made our share of mistakes too. And our idea is that we hope to have an entrepreneur who gets excited about not only talking about those areas and needs, but actually really leveraging our network and using our frame of reference to help think through like the right person for those roles, and will they scale for 12, 24 months and beyond, grow the company from 5, 10 people to 50 to 100 people. So I think that where I think sometimes I see entrepreneurs get really get really worried about micromanaging is I do see VCs. I have been on my share of board calls where VCs are going deep into the product roadmap and talking about, should you be building on Azure or GCP or OpenAI, and making sure you have the right format of colors and buttons. And I just don't think that's even if you had a product management background before you got into VC, that's not your role as a VC. I think that a lot of people, myself included, when I started in VC, nearly 2 decades ago, coming from startup side, now I've mostly been in VC, think, oh, well, hey, I had all these experiences and, I'm going to start opining on that. And I had a board member pull me aside. He was like, Somek, I don't care if you ran product at a company that went public. You're not the one doing it here. If you want to quit your job as a VC and actually want to work for this startup, then but so I think you have to find that balance. But I think part of it is also,
Yeah.
again, really what the entrepreneur wants, because entrepreneurs, I'm curious what you see in your world, but like I think one thing that we talk about always internally at ASV is that there's a reason why entrepreneurs sometimes push back when investors have requests or information. I mean, by definition, I count myself as an entrepreneur, as someone who launched ASV. You don't necessarily like working for other people, and you don't want other people, even on your board, suddenly to give you advice. So it's really important you figure that out beforehand. So I think that the idea is that if you think about VCs, where I think great early stage VCs, if they have done the successfully before, can provide advice, is on recruiting senior talent and actually helping you land that talent. It's about maybe hopefully introductions to some marquee customers and channel partners, and then ultimately the follow-on capital and the strategic M&A heads that can be your acquirers, investors, and later acquirers down the road. And those are the
Yeah.
areas that we really focus on as a fund.
Yeah, no, I think that's the value that entrepreneurs are looking for. And of course, there are some minor details that may be super useful, but I think you nailed it all. All right, so your background. So where did you grow up? What were you like as a child?
Yeah. So I was born in the late 1970s. I was born in Pittsburgh. My family, my parents were both immigrants from India. They met actually when they were in grad school, in the U.S. back in the 70s. But so I was born in Pittsburgh, and I lived there until I was 10. Moved to closer to where you are. I was in outside of Philadelphia, where my father was a professor at Villanova. And then I spent my formative years, middle school, high school, in Vermont. My father was at UVM, and I moved in. I was in Boston. I went to college at MIT during the late '90s, and then I lived in New York City for, I guess, nearly 13 years before I launched Armory Square Ventures here in upstate New York. So, as a kid, like I was definitely a nerd. I loved both math, science, and as well as music. And I found I loved finding ways. If I look at kind of what drew me to venture capital, I think it's one of the to me it's like the perfect blend of left brain, right brain. There is the analysis portion for sure, but there's a humanistic side of assessing talent and managing people and relationships and connecting the dots of very disparate industries, mapping technologies to markets and people, connecting together to hopefully create a world-class company. And it's even though I've been doing this now for nearly 2 decades, it's still, I consider it an incredibly stimulating profession and something that builds on a lot of things that I appreciated and learned growing up.
So before getting into venture, like how did you get your career started?
Where how my career started. So after I graduated from college in the late 90s, I basically moved to New York City. Initially, like many people back then, when they were moving to New York City, would start off in Wall Street. So I did a very short stint at a firm called Broadview. Broadview later was acquired by Jefferies, but it was one of the last really kind of freestanding boutique M&A firms focusing on technology and software companies. The firm was run by former engineers and successful founders. And so I did that for a little while, but if you recall, like in the late 90s, everybody was joining startups. And I basically followed my peers. I just stuck with it a little longer than many of my friends who returned to Wall Street or consulting. So I moved over to a firm called Deal Time, later rebranded as shopping.com. It was one of the first comparison shopping engines on the internet. That company, grew to over 100 million in revenue, went public on the NASDAQ, was acquired by eBay. I initially was involved with product management, later managed business development. I can't claim any of the credit for that, how successful that company was. Right place, right time. Amazing people were running the helm. I had many more responsibilities than I should have as a person in my 20s. But I was there for until mid 2000s, and then the company relocated to Silicon Valley when the tech bubble burst. So the VCs actually, I believe, told our management team, you can't create a world-class tech company in New York City. New York City is a finance town. And I obviously believed differently, and I moved over to a digital health company that was a precursor to GLG, and I moved after that company was acquired, I moved to the venture side in 2005.
All right, so getting into venture, so how did you make that leap?
Yeah, so with venture, so by the time I had my second startup exit, I was looking at going into business school, potentially taking a break from, business for a while, figuring out my next journey. And before business school, I was actually asked to by one of my classmates, actually, who actually I featured in our annual meeting, Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy. He said, before business, like, Somak, there's this interesting position that one of my friends from HBS posted, which said that they're looking for a person to really build a community of people in New York City to connect deal makers who are investing in technology companies, VCs, with CIOs and CTOs. So when I say CIOs, oftentimes when you go to venture podcasts, people are thinking chief investment office. I'm talking about chief information officers, people who are in charge of technology buying at the largest firms in industry, right? And then the heads of M&A. All of these groups had connections to an organization called the Software and Information Industry Association. So I did that for a few months, thought I would do this before going to business school. And I ended up staying on for about almost 2.5 years because I had so much, and I was enjoying really understanding how customers buy technology companies, how venture capitalists invest in startups, and then how people and heads of M&A at Google and Microsoft buy companies. And what was interesting is because it was a nonprofit, I got to basically get, complete access to everything they were thinking because they were just like, they felt comfortable. I wasn't pitching a solution. It was just really getting to understand how things work there. And if you remember back then, at the end of the day, the VCs stopped investing in early 2000s at the tech bubble burst. And so everybody was, somewhat similar to here. I mean, there's obviously venture funds investing, but it was a more capital scarce environment. So the only way to ultimately create liquidity and ultimately, generate returns was through customers and M&A. And so I did that for about 2.5 years. And it was in the middle of my time at that organization that I was recruited by Edison Partners. Edison was then called Edison Venture Fund. And that fund was an early pioneer of investing in secondary markets, in high growth B2B software companies in software markets. And so one of my, actually, who now works with us at ASV, his name is Steve Ovagimian, he actually said, Somak, you've had experience, building products, selling companies. You've managed to develop this amazing community. Why not come to our side of the table and to join the venture side? So that's what brought me into venture in 2005. So that's a little bit more about how I started my career in venture. Yeah.
So right into it. So started sourcing deals and working with companies. What was that journey like?
Yeah, so interestingly, when I started in venture, I had a little bit of an unconventional role in venture. So I initially started in a role which was really more of like a channel partnership manager role. So if you think about software sales, many software sales either have inside sales or field salespeople, or they have channel salespeople who are really kind of camped out in some of the key partners and ultimately trying to create more sales and marketing leads to help generate revenue. So the founding partner at Edison had developed a similar model in the venture side. It was like a business development manager. And so what I did was I was just spending my first year or two in venture, just literally doing, all the important like relationship building with angel funds, with incubators, accelerators, with lawyers, accountants, software entrepreneurs, with LPs. And I was kind of, I guess, I was young enough back then where I didn't mind doing double lunches and double dinners and going to golf events and cocktail hours. And my goal was to really go to all of these meetings and leave with actual leads for Edison to invest in. But as part of my experience there, I was kind of going up and down the mid-Atlantic areas like Boston all the way to North Carolina to Pittsburgh. Those relationships ended up being extremely important for me later on in my career. So, where you think of many people who enter venture, some people enter laterally into venture capital after they've successfully exited multiple companies and become venture partners or operating partners, right? Other people start kind of more kind of junior roles and are doing more of the analysis execution and then move into more partner level roles over time. I kind of started did a head of a hybrid approaches. Even when I started, I wasn't starting as an operating partner because I'd done 5 or 6 years of startups, but I was asked to ultimately cut my teeth really, building out the referral network and learning the art of sourcing. And that's what I started initially doing, again, through the more indirect channels. And then by year two, I moved into a more traditional investment role where I was involved with boards. And I that was kind of how my initial career in venture started. The reason I ultimately left Edison and moved over to what's now known as Tribeca Venture Partners was that as much as I enjoyed my time at Edison, I think there was a very structured program at Edison to learn all the key best practices of sourcing, analysis, execution. It was like almost like a rotation program where you had exposure to all the areas of the venture skill set. I really felt that, my passion was on the early stage side, especially where I could find companies that had early evidence of product market fit, but where there was really opportunity to take some, sales execution risk and help assemble teams and create alpha that way. And that was what really led me to join what's now known as Tribeca Venture Partners. And I've really stayed in that sort of stage of investing ever since.
Okay, so what led you down the path of starting Armory Square Ventures?
Yeah. So I had been at Tribeca for, it must have been now, I guess, probably almost 7 years. And I definitely had the entrepreneurial itch at that point. And this was before the whole micro VC craze where many more people were starting funds, especially I think 2016, 17, 18 and beyond. And so I was basically I must have been 2012. I was enjoying my time in New York City tech. I'd become a partner and I was making good money, and I was like, my God, like how I had to pinch myself, like this is amazing. I've been waiting for New York City tech to come, into the kind of the mainstream of just being a place where you could create a world class company. And I was actually then called. One of my friends said, Somak, there's a group of investors that want to launch a venture fund in upstate New York, modeled after groups like Foundry Group in Boulder, Colorado. And I think we were discussing before this podcast started, Keith, that was Brad Feld and Seth Levine and his team have always been an inspiration for me. And I, as someone who was born in Pittsburgh and grew up in Vermont and, spent a lot of time in middle America, even when I was at Edison, I felt that New York City tech was incredibly exciting, but getting a little frothy, frankly. And I felt that the real opportunity to generate alpha for the type of strategy I was excited about was in underventured markets where you have all the key ingredients of a venture ecosystem, but you're really lacking the traditional institutional lead investor who can not only price rounds, but attract talent, customers, and following capital. And so this was an idea that a bunch of these early investors in upstate New York were toying with for years. And I didn't know until they met me that they'd already met with dozens of other potential GPs to start the fund. I initially, didn't take their call very seriously. I did it really. I made a trip over there as a courtesy to my friend. And then I saw the people, and I just absolutely I fell in love with the region. I was so impressed with their vision. And I just felt like, I was at a stage in my career where I was like, look, if I don't do this now, I don't know if I ever will. And the other thing was as much as I love the opportunity to generate returns, and we've been very grateful that the fund has generated significant returns, I also felt that there was an opportunity to create an impact on regions that had been left for dead for decades. And the idea is that if this did work, this could be something that would be much more meaningful than just generating strong returns to your pension fund investors or to your institutional endowment investors, right? That was something that there was a real personal connection when people I met here said that, if you are successful, larger companies will one day come here. Children, grandchildren who are already coming here for universities will actually start companies here. That was always a vision. And that doesn't always work. There's a lot of things about luck and timing, but thanks to the pandemic and other things that happened with Micron, agreeing to, invest 100 billion in a town that's 20 miles away, like it turned out that some of those things actually did materialize too. And so that was really what was the impetus behind launching ASV, was to really be an optimism engine for the region, to create world-class returns and to ultimately create a vibrant venture ecosystem like Foundry did in Boulder, but for regions like the upstate and Midwest regions of the US.
So, and like these are secondary cities like Syracuse and Buffalo and even like Indianapolis.
That's right. We can technically invest anywhere in the US or Canada, but we proactively focus when we go outside of markets like New York City or Boston, where we've got deep networks. We tend to focus on cities like Buffalo, Syracuse, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Cleveland, or Indianapolis. They all have, often have strong university ecosystems. They have low cost of living, high quality of life. They have evidence of talent migration into those cities, which was accelerated during the pandemic, and a successful history of exits too. But they also are home to many old line industries that have huge market sizes, but are in the early stages of digital transformation. And that's another area where we feel like we have, an edge compared to our peers. Like, it's one thing to use AI to say and say, look, I'd like to invest in AI technology to solve an issue in construction and trucking, and to do that from Silicon Valley. But when you literally are based in the region where those industries are based, and you can call up your LPs who come from those industries, it's real. It's something that I feel is a real competitive advantage compared to our peers.
Well, I think it's important to highlight like a portfolio company that you invested in that went public in Buffalo, ACV Auctions. So that was
Mhm.
like born and bred in Buffalo, right? Scaled to a publicly traded company.
That's exactly right. I mean, the thing that's interesting is that automotive, as a segment, is still like one of the largest industries in our country, and where much of the attention in the Silicon Valley press is on companies like Tesla or Rivian. Those are very, very important companies. Don't get me wrong, and they're, Elon Musk. No matter what, people might have, differences of opinion on his style, is obviously one of the greatest, founders of our time. But the reality is there's so many opportunities to address the inefficiencies that exist in the traditional legacy industries in automotive. And that's what ACV did. ACV was started by a group of founders who came from the automotive industry and saw that the whole process of buying and selling cars was very inefficient. You already had for many years, companies that were, successful like Amazon and eBay, in doing stuff in the B2B space. But when ACV launched, most dealers were buying and sell cars through brokers. And so they founded really one of the first digital auction platforms for the automotive industry. The issue that they faced was that they really needed some talent that could really help them scale the company nationally. So we helped persuade George Shamoun to join the company at time of the Series A. And then later on, we recruited my college classmate, Vikas Mehta, as COO, who was formerly the COO of eBay Canada, head of eBay Germany. And we also helped bring in other later stage capital sources, both from the automotive industry, but also from the fund side. And I think that's definitely, I guess the best example of how you can hopefully add value to a company is being able to persuade talent to join at all stages of the company's growth, introductions to customers, partners, and ultimately, the follow-on capital up through to the IPO. We are incredibly grateful for all the great work that all the founders and executives at ACV did. But what's really exciting for me now is that we're talking to numerous companies that are influenced by ACV. So you mentioned, for example, Keith, that Clem at Machinery Partner, who you've interviewed before at VentureFizz. The reason why we led, the Series A round last year was that Clem had been studying ACV as a comp and had actually asked if one of his angel investors, Jay Levy, if he knew any of the people with ACV, and he's like, absolutely, I can actually connect you to the investors who were involved from the very beginning and help recruit the team. And so it's really been exciting to see opportunities to apply some of the learnings from prior investment like ACV and seeing how it brings you into investments into marketplaces and adjacent industries. We're also looking at companies that are now led by second, third generation ACV talent, right? Which is something that has happened in all major metro hubs for a long time, whether it's Silicon Valley or New York City or Boston. But we're beginning to see that happen. So it's really cool to see, companies that are now led by people that we backed or like who are kind of starting their careers at ACV, but are now building their own companies too and leveraging their experiences and networks from ACV.
What's of interest these days? I'm sure you have different areas that you are particularly focused on, but is there, things that you're specifically really tuning into these days?
We're focusing on what we've really done throughout our entire careers, and especially since ASV was launched, which is generally leading seed and Series A rounds in B2B software companies. Most of our companies are either B2B SaaS or B2B marketplace technology companies. Now, when you look at industry verticals, we are somewhat opportunistic. We've obviously invested in, being venture investors who started off in New York City and other larger metro markets. We invested in all the traditional industries in New York City, like financial technology, digital health, right? Marketing services technology. But when you look at some of the big industries in our backyard, whether it's in the upstate or Midwest, we've invested obviously in automotive and now construction tech with Machinery Partner. We look at a lot of areas like manufacturing, transportation, logistics. So again, old line industries that are in early stages of digital transformation are very interesting. We also love the area of food and hospitality tech. So we led the seed round in Bento Box, which was acquired by Fiserv a few years ago. And we've made numerous other investments in the hospitality tech space. So that's an area that I invested in not only at ASV, but starting earlier in my time at Tribeca, a company called Shopkeep, which is a mobile point of sale kind of a company that was a precursor to Toast. So those are just examples of industry verticals we invest in, where the common horizontal theme is B2B software, B2B SaaS or marketplace.
So what's the best way for an entrepreneur to get on your radar as far as getting that first meeting? And what do you expect out of that first meeting with an entrepreneur?
Yeah. So, we try to, in order to, when we love, entrepreneurs who reach out to us directly as well as come through our, referral networks. I mean, I think some of the best ways to ultimately get, any VC excited is to ultimately not only reach out directly, but if you have a connection to a person that works with the fund, especially an entrepreneur, that's another really good way to make sure that you're on our radar. But in general, like we're very much, if you want to reach out to us, it's like Somak at armorysv.com. Like we have definitely invested in companies that have come over the transom. In terms of where, what are the type of things that we're looking for in a first meeting? We're really, looking for, in a first meeting, we're looking to really get comfort with 4 or 5 key areas, right? One of the first most important areas is the market opportunity and market size, right? So the idea is that, for us is that can this company ultimately, address a billion or ideally multi-billion-dollar market, right? And also in the area of market is there some evidence that there is product market fit that may not be readily apparent through financials? Because again, we get in quite early. So, you may not have much revenue. In fact, most of our companies didn't have much revenue when we invested. Most of our companies do have some, at least commercial product in the market, but the might be light. What's more important is that are we seeing like pilots that people are doing, and if they're successful, can it ultimately create nonlinear growth? And if there is a commercially, if the product is commercial, can we put that company in front of prospects in our network of technology buyers to get an early evidence that is this a must-have versus a nice-to-have? So market is one key area. There's the management team and doing our own human capital assessment. And in that particular area, we spend time figuring out, does the management team not only have a CEO who has domain expertise in the industry, but does she or he also have a strong product technology leader that's part of the team? We don't back one woman or one man teams. We want someone who can, at the early stages, show they can attract technical talent, which is, as you know, very difficult to do without funding. So it gives us some evidence of are they a talent magnet? We also try to better understand competition, defensibility, unit economics, and is there a path to ultimately capital efficient growth? And then the last thing we look at is really the fundraise milestones, right? Is just understanding, do they have realistic goals in terms of what they're looking to achieve with this raise? And do we believe that we, by leading the round, could help quickly, put together a round that would give the company at least 18 months, but ideally 24 months to really prove out the milestones to raise that next round of funding, which is typically what the next milestone is. So we look at all those kind of 4 or 5 areas initially, and then there's, I've said this in numerous, interviews or podcasts. Like I think there is also a qualitative element, which is, for us, entrepreneurship is a long journey. Entrepreneurs get to choose who they work with. Investors, we get to choose who we work with. Entrepreneurs, looking to do 4 or 5 investments a year personally, right? So for me, I want to feel so passionate about that company entrepreneur that I can't stop thinking about it, can't stop talking about it with my friends, my family, and there's a part of me that wants me to quit my job to work for that entrepreneur. I have to feel that level of conviction. You really learn about things obviously after you start working together. But if you're kind of on the fence, you're like, yeah, I thought about it, but yeah, I'm not that interested, right? Like it's not something that I'm ready to cash chits on for that entrepreneur and call up the C-suite of every tech company I know to really see if they can start working with them. Then it's that's not the right fit potentially for ASV. That's kind of how we look at evaluating companies.
And then what's the process to actually get a term sheet and then, funds wired?
Yep. So we are trying to get more and more efficient with that process. So I think we can move very quickly. We've done investments in a matter of weeks from the first meeting. But I think the biggest, the biggest predictor of whether something will go from a partner meeting to a term sheet is making sure that we can get a few. First of all, from an IC meeting, we have an investment committee meeting where we have the company pitch us. And we've been noticed recently, we've really adopted a strategy where we know how difficult it's a fundraise. We've gone through fundraises ourselves just as recently as this past year, right? This fundraising is not for the faint of the heart. So if we are on the fence about investment, we often tell them the same day, right? The hours after the meeting. But if we are interested in pursuing investment, what we like to do is, have the company speak to a few people in our network. That could be done hopefully very efficiently in a matter of a few weeks, talking to customer prospects, talking to advisors who have expertise in the industry, and ideally, kind of tag teaming all of them in kind of one Zoom call or meeting, or 1 or 2 meetings. And if we leave that, in 1 or 2 weeks after an investment committee meeting, if we get enough conviction that this, that the data points are checking out, that this is something that we believe can scale and which is a good use of our time and networks and relationships, we can then issue a term sheet, within weeks from when the company presents. Sometimes it's like days after we present if we front loaded some of the work before the investment committee call. And then from there, it's really going through legal and closing, which depending on the state of your data room and your legal docs, it could be 2 to 4 weeks. I think it's always good to budget at least a month or so, from term sheet to close.
Bessemer Venture Partners has what they call their anti-portfolio on their website, which I love because VCs, they like to talk about their successful exits, which makes sense. But I love how they talk about, hey, man, we had the opportunity to invest in this company and we passed or it just didn't quite work out. So are there any examples that you would add to your anti-portfolio?
There are 2 companies that I met earlier in my venture career. I'm not going to say that, I can't say that they were absolutely, they would have taken my money. I was very early in my career, but one company was Venmo. That was a company that pitched me early on, and I just thought it was an interesting idea. But it felt like they're really going to be able to create the network effect. And sure enough, like Venmo is obviously now a verb, right? Anytime when you Uber or Instacart, anytime you have a company that becomes a verb, that's obviously a miss. And then in one of my other companies that we didn't get very far in, but we were looking at back when it was just a fledgling company, was Pinterest. And I remember that our office manager, Kelly, was like, you guys won't believe this is such an unbelievable idea. My grandma, my aunts, everyone's pinning these boards. I remember it was like when the first time I realized the importance of having diverse teams and bringing more people of different backgrounds on your team. Like all the men, myself included, were like, that's the craziest idea ever. Like, why would you want to pin things? Like, who does that, right? So I'm also, to be fair, I'm a B2B investor, so I would never be the person who would probably identify the next blockbuster consumer technology. But those are two examples of companies that I'm really grateful that they were so successful. But I guess we were privileged to at least be able to evaluate those companies like early in our careers.
Building a marketplace is it's tough, right? It's not an easy thing to do because you need both sides to work effectively. So what advice would you have for entrepreneurs on building a marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, marketplaces are absolutely very difficult to figure out because unlike SaaS businesses where you're selling a software solution, a subscription basis, in the marketplace world, you have to make sure that the market, that industry is truly ready for a marketplace. So, are there enough buyers who would buy on the platform? Are there sellers who would sell on the platform? And are you creating enough value as a marketplace to ultimately, replace the legacy way of doing business, which is often sometimes just, dealers or intermediaries. So in terms of, best practices, I think in terms of marketplace businesses, I think it's always good to, before you ultimately raise a lot of funding, to start figuring out, if you're investing if you're building a marketplace in manufacturing or trucking or logistics, focus on a few core geographies and see whether you have some early evidence that there's something that's replicable across these different geographies. And if you're seeing that, in that marketplace, as you're starting to set up stuff on the supply and demand, if you're seeing repeat usage, if you're seeing that you're able to create network effects, which ultimately translate beyond that geography, but move into adjacent geographies, right? And ultimately people are really, using this as a vital way of actually transacting in their business. I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's really important is that, you should be looking early on when you're building a marketplace at some of the other adjacent areas that remove friction in marketplaces. So those areas we often include payment processing or lending. And one of the most important things that any marketplace is supposed to do is ultimately, this is what George Shamoun, the CEO of ACV, said when he started ACV. He was like, I want to create trust and transparency in my industry, right? In the case of automotive, like people often use the phrase, oh, he sells like a used car salesman. It obviously wasn't something where people necessarily it wasn't something where you definitely had a great reputation per se, right? But you could use that same, analogy in other industries, which have people who, did business a certain way and where the customer is seeking trust and transparency. And if they have that real strong pain point need and you think you can solve that, I think that that's a really important thing. When you're starting a marketplace, you might initially have to see the demand. You might have to be more of the broker yourself and buy some of the inventory and sell it. But that's another thing I would be careful about when you're building a marketplace, right? Sometimes entrepreneurs get stuck in the trap of doing stuff off their balance sheet and trying to see demand initially, but they keep doing that to develop to start growth, but they haven't been able to successfully persuade the end customer to use an online tool to be a primary way in which they buy, right? So part of it is also, we saw this happen at ACV and Machinery Partners done this now beautifully, is that you have to, in the early days, get people to say, okay, you might do these things a certain way. You call up this person, you call up that person, but now let's work together, use this software tool. And the next time you buy the product, you might not even have to call me. Like, try to figure out ways in which you get comfortable enough buying that through the online platform. And once they have a successful buying experience and they start re-upping and inviting other buyers or other sellers, that's when the magic of a marketplace happens, where you create that network effect.
Now, what advice do you have for founders that are building a company in one of these, secondary cities? I guess I could look at it, since the pandemic, location has become different than what it was before. Um, so are you seeing companies that are hiring remote anywhere, or are you advising them on, like a lot of companies I see in Boston, New York, they're kind of starting to sway back to hybrid local, meaning they're looking for local talent, but it's not expected to be in the office 5 days a week because they're going to work hybrid. So what advice do you have for founders that are, trying to hire and build a team locally in these secondary cities?
Yes, I mean, hiring talent, especially in this post-pandemic world, to your point, where things are hybrid and remote, is one of the most interesting challenges I think any person business has today. It's really, there's some incredible benefits of the fact that you can tap this distributed workforce, but there's also the fact that, if indeed Amazon and Meta and Google can hire in your market today, you obviously have much more competition, right? I mean, so what's interesting is like the whole aspect of remote distributed workforce has been a double-edged sword for secondary markets. The pros are now more and more companies are comfortable hiring people wherever they are, which means that more people are local and even more people are beginning to consider moving into these markets because they realize they could work for whichever firm they were, but just be based closer to where they want to live, right? I think the problem is that the cons is that you have more people that could pay higher salaries, and you're definitely it's more competition. I think the way which you win in the talent hiring strategy in secondary markets is by doing what I've seen happen over and over again with whether it's ACV in Buffalo, or today I just caught up with my friend Shetty Hampson, who was the founder of TCG Player, which was a company that was acquired by eBay a few years ago, right? And the idea is that these founders, are really spending a lot of time really building the communities around them and saying, like, look, if you're a developer and engineer, you want to roll out of bed and start coding for Amazon one day, and the next day be working for Meta, maybe this is not the company for you. But if you want to have a place where you're actually going to get mentorship and training, and you're going to actually build a community, and if we're successful, completely change the trajectory of this region. And by the way, be a big fish in a small pond. Like when you create the company that is, whether it's a nine-figure exit or a multi-billion-dollar exit in the case of ACV, there's people rooting for you who are like, oh my God, that's like really cool what you did, right? Like, how can I be on your team? And like, it's kind of like this hometown pride that you have that's sometimes more difficult to have in a place like the Bay Area, New York. New York City and Bay Area have a lot of advantages though. The density of talent, there's Boston, like you can't beat that, right? So there's definitely pros and cons of each approach, but that's where I feel like in terms of secondary markets, in terms of how you as a founder succeed here, is if you're able to sell on the quality of life, the low cost of living, and if you ideas that you can sell that community that you're building here. Some people don't want that; they just want to just be kind of stuck at home doing their coding, and then they just do what they want, surfing or hiking and not be doing things. But if your idea is that you want to interact with people, and I think people do want to do that, honestly. Like there is, whether you're young or old, employers are demanding hybrid models. But I think numerous employees, especially people early in their career, want that mentorship and training. And I think that that's something that is very appealing to our founders. You also have much higher retention in these companies, right? Yes, you might be competing with Amazon, Google, and Meta, so there's definitely more competition, but you're not competing with like thousands of companies like you are in some of these larger cities. So the nice thing is that when you spend the time mentoring and training them, they may go on to go join other successful companies, which is a win for the region. But you're more likely, if you look at the data, you're more likely to have them for longer periods of time because they're much more invested in being part of this community.
Yeah, and obviously the scenery can be amazing too, such as the case with your firm. Your you showed me before we started recording, you have a beautiful lake view, so that doesn't
It's
hurt to have your
really very
office right on
special.
like a dock and a boat, and like like that's a nice plus. So,
We're very
okay, so
blessed.
top three apps you can't live without. It can't be Gmail, Slack, calendar.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, in terms of apps that I really enjoy, I really love, I mean, I love reading, so anything related to books. I mean, I use Audible like all the time, and there's now new AI tools that you can use to just basically, there used to be Autumn, which then New York Times acquired and shut down, but there's other new tools that I've been researching that I'm playing around with that actually read, have AI technologies that are reading papers and publications. And so I'm definitely, I'm maybe someone who grew up with music. Like I'm definitely like a person who likes listening, and whether it's podcasts like your VentureFizz or or ultimately books, that's one thing I spend a lot of time with. I like everyone in terms of in the tech industry, I'm experimenting with more of the AI tools out there, right? So I have to do that for a living, right? Obviously, when I'm evaluating investments, but it's been really exciting to play around not only with ChatGPT for OpenAI, but Claude and other type of AI tools, Mid Journey. Like there's just so many things I feel that you can do today, especially creatively, like in arts and music, that if I still find interesting as a middle-aged person, but I feel like if I was a kid in my teenage years or 20s, like I just can't imagine like how much fun it would be to geek out on these tools that use AI to do things, especially in the creative side. So I think that's another area that I love spending time with. And then in terms of music, obviously, I'm just getting back to my music roots. I love Spotify and I love that's another area that I probably spend a lot of time. And that those are kind of my major apps that I the AI the Audible and listening podcasts as well as Spotify.
Well, as an extension of this, and you already mentioned some books, but like a podcast or book recommendation for entrepreneurs.
And there's so many. I would say that, like I would say, like in terms of book recommendations, actually, our office has kind of like a minute has like almost a library for venture capital and buildings in secondary markets. So one book that we featured actually, we tend to feature authors at our annual meetings every year. Last year, I'll bring it here. We actually brought this one. This is Chris Miller, who is the author of a book called Chip War,
Hmm.
the fight for the world's most critical technology. I mean,
Wow.
so after it is maybe one of the most interesting books I've ever read about the history of the technology sector. And even though many of us in venture capital invest in software, at the end of the day, all the plumbing for industry is in the chips. Obviously, Nvidia is an example of that, right? But the
Mhm.
fact that your phone, that your iPhone has five, 10 billion transistors in a piece of hardware this small. It's just mind boggling, and the whole geopolitics of that in terms of what's going on with U.S. and China and the whole area of technology innovation is fascinating. Another area of book that are you talking about business books basically? Is that what
Yeah, pretty much.
you're asking?
I mean, sometimes people go like, in a different topic, so it's up to you. But
Yeah, I mean, for my business books, I'd say like kind of other books that I strongly recommend is we actually we as a venture fund. I know this sounds really dorky, but as part of our monthly offsites, we have a book club discussion on the first night of every offsite. So we've gone through our shares of books, right? So this week we're covering Super Bosses by Sidney Finkelstein, like the idea of how you create lineages of boss and what are the best practices of identifying super bosses, right? We had there's a book that I ask every entrepreneur to spend time reading called Who by Jeffrey
Mhm.
Smart, which
Sure.
is have you done stuff with are
I'm
you
very
familiar with
familiar with
Jeffrey
it, but
Smart?
it's one of those books where I'm like, I need to just add that to my, Audible, Spotify list too. But I've heard it mentioned several times.
Yeah, it's such a critical framework that he created years ago towards evaluating, assessing talent, and that's something that I used to this day, but I forgot about until we brought it up for one of our book readings. And we have one more book I'll share is a book that we also featured this author 2 years ago, Sebastian Malaby's the book called The Power Law, which is also a wonderful history about the venture capital industry told not just through Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia and Excel, but into the modern age, Andreessen Horowitz and Founders Fund. And it's actually honestly one of the reasons I launched ASV3. I was unsure. I was like, we'd been very successful in our earlier funds, and I was like, do I really want to commit to another 10 years? And after I read this book and I saw that the founders of these funds were able to create these institutions that were far bigger than who they were. And
Mhm.
that was something that was really, really very inspiring.
All right. So what do you like to do for fun outside of work?
Yeah, I mean, so the nice thing about venture is it never really feels like work. I definitely, but one of the areas that I love doing, is outside of VC is I love everything related to food. Like I'm a big foodie, and that's one of the things I love doing here in this region, merging my interests in technology, investing in food. So I picked up like probably like many people did during the pandemic. I picked up cooking. Some people started making sourdough bread. I really missed Indian food after leaving New York City, so I built a tandoor. Are you familiar with the tandoor? Or it's basically like a clay oven. Kind of think of it like it's like if you've seen pizza ovens, which are horizontal,
Mhm.
Tandoor is basically a vertical, oven which heats up to 900 degrees. Is how you make naan or different types
Mhm.
of kebab. So that's
Sure.
something that I really enjoy doing in my pastime, cooking many different types of dishes and hosting people for meals. I love boating and the water here. Like I was living here on the lake. Like that's something that I can't get enough of. I only wish I could do that year round. And I love reading and then fitness and yoga. Like for me, yoga and meditation was something I really started doing in 2008. I think I've always suffered from, some mild form of anxiety. I've always wired, and I think it's been a nice counterbalance. Like when you think of I think a lot of people who are drawn to startups or VC tend to have some. I don't think they called it ADD back then. I'm sure if I was diagnosed today, I would probably have some version of it today. I think that things like yoga and meditation have helped keep me grounded and keep me away from my phone and device, and that's something that has been a real amazing, a lifesaver for me.
All right, cool. Well, Somak, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through your background story and journey. Obviously, all the great work you're doing as an investor in these secondary cities, because that's incredibly meaningful. So
Thank you. I really
appreciate
appreciate the really great questions, Keith, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much for the time.